Right, not far from the Amber Hotel is this interesting place where they've got a mermaid and a giraffe, all made from wicker. It's like Wicker's world there. Everything made from wicker, huge great big sculptures made out of wicker, and inside there you can buy pretty much whatever you like sculptured from wicker. So if you're a complete basket case, that's the place to go. The name of the city, by the way, or the town, is Olesnice, but this is one of the outskirts of Olesnice. It's called Cześle, and that's where the Amber Hotel is. It's as you go towards Warsaw from Olesnice, so not far from Olesnice. So we're now driving towards Olesnice. It's 3 degrees. It has been above, it's the 24th of February. It has been above zero now for several days, but of course the freeze was so long and so large that we've still got largely a lot of snow out here, and over the fields there it's just snow the whole way, but it does look quite pretty. These little beeches, quite young beeches, birches, pardon me, not beeches, but birches there, young birches, reforested this area, as you can tell, younger trees, 15-year-old, 10 to 15-year-old trees. After the changes in the economy, and when Minister Balcerowicz was still in, or Professor Balcerowicz, don't know which is the higher way of talking about him, but yeah, Professor Balcerowicz was still in power as finance minister. There was a scheme whereby you could get a tax break if you planted shrubs, and not only did you get a tax break, but also you got given the small tree saplings, not shrubs, saplings, and so saplings, people gave over part of their land from other agricultural purposes onto forestry, and they were given these saplings which they planted. And when you go past a young forest these days, or a young copse or young woodland, then that's basically what it all comes from. And Poland was reporting 19% of its territory forested in the beginning of the 1990s. Right now it reports 22% of its territory covered in forest. So that's just a sort of example of what tax breaks, or fiscal engineering if you like, can do to the geography of a place. Pity that they don't do something like that in places where the rainforest is endangered, for example, because that would be perhaps one way of ensuring that that there's some kind of limit to it. So now this is Spalica, which is one of the other outskirts of Olesnice. Virtually Spalica finishes and Olesnice starts. There's no kind of no man's land between it like there is to go to Cześle. But it's all very nice. This is, by the way, which part of Poland? Not far from Wrocław, so it's called Lower Silesia, Dolny Śląsk, which is Lower Silesia. It used to, of course, be German. At some stage, this was fairly much not far from the limit of German, of it being German at the end of up to the end of the Second World War, and after that, after this area here, then you would have basically a German names for everything. I'm not sure what Olesnice was called, but even till now in this city you can see examples of German architecture. And I think if you look up ahead, even at that water tower there, you can see that's very typical German architecture there on the water tower. I think I've shown you something very similar to that in Chev, which is also ex-German. So these red brick buildings here are pretty much giving the game away. This is already Olesnice proper, of course. So there we are. That building there is a clear piece of indication, and this one there most certainly, of the past of this city. And now we drive in the direction of Kluczbork, which has also a German ring about it and is in the Opole region, if I'm not mistaken, which is also very German. And as I think I've shown you before on these films driving through the Opole region, there are still bilingual villages where the signs are up in German as well as in Polish, and there's a German party which has some representation at Parliament. So there's for the people that didn't get repatriated. Basically, they didn't repatriate the countryside, but they did repatriate the larger towns. Basically, it's not a good idea, generally speaking, as Mr. Mugabe found out in pursuance of his policies to prefer the sort of, if you like, the indigenous nations of Zimbabwe to the white settlers from the former centuries. You know, he didn't recognise their claim also to be Zimbabweans in the way that we would recognise in the West black people's claims to be British and German, French, whatever. If they've been there for, you know, if they were born there, educated there, been there for generations, then it should be beyond doubt that they're part of the nation, not discriminated on based on the colour of their skin. Nevertheless, that happened to the white Zimbabweans. They were taken out of their farms, which they, of course, they knew the land, they knew how to farm it, and people without agricultural qualifications, so basically they had racial qualifications, were placed in the stead of these white farmers, and as a result of which Mugabe soon had to have his hand out for food aid, which hadn't been the case before, because people that had run the farms for generations knew, of course, how to make food from the land. And if you don't know, you know, if you don't know how to turn land into food, then you'd better be good at eating soil, because it don't happen automatically. You have to know how to do it. You have to know what you're about. Okay, lots of people seem to think, a lot of towny people seem to think, oh, anybody can be a farmer. This is actually not the case. It demands an education, and it demands a calling, and it demands experience, and not just a few years' experience. It demands experience over a whole many long years to be able to deal with the various requirements of making food out of the land. And of course we need food, so it's a question which is, you might say, okay, you rather chubby gentleman, you don't need that much food, so why are you talking about it? But basically human beings, and anybody else for that matter, needs food. So agriculture is an important thing. If you screw up your agriculture, then you're really screwed up. And so, knowing that much, the Polish authorities, which are fairly savvy when it comes to agriculture, basically said, we're not going to repatriate the country people because they're farmers, they know how to work this land. Who else are we going to stick on it? So let them get on with it. So they've got their attachment to the land. The people that work the land in that way, they get very upset if they have to sell it or leave it. They get very sentimental about the land itself. It's been in their families for generations, and basically they were able to stay. But Wrocław was pretty much completely repatriated to Germany. And on the other hand, the same thing happened over in in the Ukraine, where Lvov was repatriated to Poland, and much of it went exactly, as you can imagine, to the places where the Germans had left. Now, to a degree, therefore, you can see that there's a certain push chain going on, that the Soviets said, get rid of your Germans and take your own people back, and we've got space for our people. So the Germans were the ones that were supposed to suffer, and the Poles were just simply going to have a transaction whereby their country moved west a bit, which may be, on balance, not necessarily a bad thing. The Polish nation sometimes loses sight, because they look at where they are on the map today, and they lose sight of the fact that, in fact, in their soul, they are a more Eastern people, a much more Eastern people, for example, than the Czechs are. The Czechs are just stuck there in the middle of Europe, whereas Poland actually used to be largely in places which are now Belarus, Lithuania, Ukraine. Those are where the Polish heartlands, if you like. Warsaw, which is the capital, is now sort of stuck over in the east of Poland, but the same Warsaw, which wasn't always capital incidentally, but the same Warsaw had in the past been quite a western city within Poland. It would be more on the western side than on the eastern side of Poland at certain parts of its history. So Poland's moved over, even geographically or physically, been shunted across towards the west of Europe, but in many ways it's still quite Eastern in its outlook, and that's not a criticism. That's simply, you know, the way which Poles think and what have you. That is in many ways, in some ways, even more Slavonic and more outlandish than you'll find among Russians sometimes, you know, more outlandish, sort of exotic to us. So basically, you know, they, unlike most of the Eastern European or Western European languages, which are based around, most Western European languages are based around addressing people as either tu, I'm using the French as an example, or vous. Yeah? German has a slight version which is more complex, where they have an ihr form, which is the plural of people that you would address individually as tu. And Spanish, when you get as far as Spain, that has in Castilian Spanish you've got tú, vosotros, and then you've got usted, which is a third person form, and ustedes, which is the plural of it, and you have lei and loro in Italian. But once again, lei and loro and usted and ustedes, they don't make any attempt to distinguish between gender. In Polish, you have the lei loro idea, or usted ustedes idea coming in. So you've got ty, you've got wy, and then on top of that you've got very sort of feudal almost forms of pan, which means lord, for a gentleman, and you address somebody not as would you like this, sir, but would sir like such and such, or would my lord like this, czy pan chce to, yeah? Whereas if it's a lady, pani means lady, okay, and then on top of that you've got państwo, which is if you're addressing more than one person, all of whom, or at least some of whom, you would like to address formally. You've got wy if everybody that you're addressing in the plural isn't addressed formally, without exception. And then if you've got a sort of mixture of people of both genders that you're addressing, at least some of them formally, then you have to address them as państwo. If you only have men, then you have panowie, and you're addressing all of them formally, or at least some of them formally. And then if you have a mixed company of people that you address, at least some of them formally, and they're all women, then you would say panie. So there you've got pan, pani, panów, or panowie, panie, and państwo. and each of them have different endings as you take them through the 7 cases of Polish, as does T and V, of course. Well, at least there are 6. I think there are about 6 different declensions of T and V, because genitive and accusative are the same. So, and actually nominative and vocative are the same, so there'd be only 5 different ones. So, so basically, as you can tell, Polish has so much complexity in the way that you address people, even before you get onto the question of titles. Because when you bring in the titles question, you have to know the titles for different types of people. And for example, if you go and see a notary public, then you have to call, if it's a gentleman, you call him Panie Rejęcie, and if it's a lady, you call her Pani Rejent. Yeah? A director in a company would be Panie Dyrektorze, but if he's on the board, then you should be really calling him Panie Prezesie. Even so, if a director itself just means a manager in charge of a department in Polish, not on the board as it does in English. So therefore, if somebody calls themselves a director, and you don't know whether they mean it in the Polish sense or the UK sense, and you address them simply as Panie Dyrektorze, Mr. Director, and it turns out that they're on the board and you should have been calling them Panie Prezesie, you could actually be doing a nietakt, as it's called in Polish. So it's exceptionally, I mean, people talk about Japanese, and that's why I'm saying it's an Eastern style of language, because people associate this very complex way of addressing people with learning, for example, Japanese, and knowing, you know, all of the honorific ways of addressing people in Japanese, and when to say san and when to say sama and all of that stuff. But that is this is nothing compared to what happens in Polish. Now, of course, Poles can hear if you don't speak with a proper accent, and I knew somebody, a very nice chap from Wales, who came to Poland and had his factory producing toothbrushes, and he learned Polish very well, but he kind of like glossed over the fact that you need to have different words for you, and so he just went around calling everybody T. And you could see that what I witnessed, what expression was on their face when this person just sort of out of the blue used the informal version to them, yeah. Which if a boss uses to you when you wouldn't normally, you know, it would stick in your throat to use to your boss, that word going back, so therefore he shouldn't be calling you that either, according to Polish, you know, usual rules of tact. You could see that the first time that he would use the informal pronoun to people, you know, you could see that the kind of split second where they looked horrified and then covered it because they realised that he was simply a foreigner, and therefore it was, for him, that word covered all the different nuances of addressing it. They shouldn't think anything by it. Yeah, but just for that split second, you'd see their faces looking utterly confused, really only down to that. And of course, when I was learning Polish, I more than once fell into the minefield of picking the wrong pronoun to, this is where I filmed that funny van the other day that was blocking the whole path. One time I actually went into a petrol station late at night, and addressing, to my mind, the company rather than particular people that were there, I said, "Czy państwo mają gazetę?" I wanted to have just to have a local paper, just to see if there's anywhere to stay in the area. And I said, "Do you have czy państwo mają gazety? Do you have papers?" And I was kind of oblivious to the fact that they might not like the fact that I'd used the pronoun for a mixed gender company when there were only two chaps sitting there and they were both men. So they responded to me saying, "There are no women here." I then thought that they thought that I wanted a girly mag, because I asked for a paper and their response was, "There are no women here." And I said, "No, I don't want that kind of paper. I'm not looking for that kind of newspaper." And then they looked at me completely blankly and said, "But we are men." And I said, "Well, I'm not denying that." Yeah? And they said, well, you said państwo, and you should have said panowie. And I said, well, sorry for breathing. I shall rephrase my sentence. Czy panowie mają gazety? No, we don't. So there we are. Didn't get anywhere with it anyway. So, but that's just a sort of nuance you have to be ready for when you're learning Polish. And that's why I suggest that in some ways Polish is a little bit more oriental in flavour than many of the Western European languages. On top of everything else, there's only one sound that you need to add to Polish, and you've got all the sounds necessary to learn Mandarin Chinese. The only sound of Mandarin Chinese which isn't already available in Polish, if you've learned Polish well, is the sound, the R, the Chinese R, sound. So you've got the sound is the only thing that Polish people don't automatically already have in their language, and it's of course available in English, the sound, if you have kind of like country accent, like sort of Johnny R's and Fars and people like that, and that is there. So Polish people can learn to do that, and then they've only got to learn one sound, not the most difficult to English sounds of Chinese, and all the things which appear to the English ear as extremely tough in Mandarin. You know, all the slight differences between about 4 or 5 different sibilant or affricative sounds. They're all already there amongst the Poles, and they already are very attuned to the differences between those sounds. So actually, especially as the language of Polish is rather sing-songy the way it's spoken in by many people. Poles are quite successful at learning Mandarin when they put their minds to it. They actually can achieve a much better accent, as well as much better comprehension of spoken Mandarin than most Europeans can. So it's another reason why Polish seems to, by my analysis, after living in this country for so many years, to have a certain more oriental flavour than most of the Western European languages, including Russian, which stands between Poland and China, which has been, by the fact of covering so much space and so many people come into it, rather simplified. Russian has, but so you'll see that the Orientalism more actually in Polish than you would in Chinese a lot of in Russian a lot of the time. More similarities in between Polish and Eastern languages than between Russian, which of course has only T and V. None of this panowie nonsense. Russian also has normal Latin days of the week and a lot of loanwords from Western languages, whereas Polish is quite low in loanwords, although there are some from Latin because of the church influence. For example, all of the, they don't have aeroport, they have lotnisko. They don't have January, February, Mart. They actually, March and May are still debatably Latin-based ones, although there are Polish scholars which will say that that's just coincidental. But other than that, you've got styczeń, luty, marzec, kwiecień, maj, and you've got czerwiec, lipiec, sierpień, wrzesień, październik, listopad, grudzień, and those are the months of the year in Polish. And as you can see, that's completely Slavonic, yeah. Whereas in Russian, they have Latinized ones. It's one of the differences between Czech and Slovak is also the fact that Czechs use Slavonic ones, and Slovaks use Latinized ones. Belarusians use Slavonic ones, but the problem is that with the Slavonic ones is that the names of the months don't always correspond to the same months. So listopad, okay, in Czech and in in Czech and in Polish are the same month, November. But in Belarusian that's October, because the leaves fall down earlier. So that's a little bit confusing, isn't it? And kwiecień, yeah, is April in Polish, but it's May in Czech. Why that is, I don't know. Whether kwiecień is related to flower, kwiat. So it may well be as simply. I don't think that the climate would mean that things would start flowering later in the Czech Republic than they do in Poland. I think, if anything, it would be the other way around by a week. If we compare the average of one country to the average of the other, obviously at the border they'd be the same. But I think that it's simply a different way of looking at the word of flowering. Yeah? In Polish, you've got the flowering month of April because that's when flowering starts. Whereas May would be the flower month with regards to the Czech Republic, because that's when you've got the most flowers. You've actually got the most flowers in evidence. So it's therefore the most flowery month. And therefore you can see that it's just as likely to be, whereas the listopad case was probably a climate case, the falling of leaves. I mean, that's a fact, yeah. Do leaves fall in October or do they fall in November? I mean, it depends where you are in Europe. Whereas you can't really account for the kwiecień case purely by climatology, because it would give you the opposite answer. So therefore it must in that case be a different way of looking at the month. Anyway, I don't know whether any of this is even remotely interesting to I expect that knowing my own listeners and my own audience, I know that there will be those of you who will be fascinated by what I've just said. Probably there'll be quite a few of you that think, well, why is he wittering on about Slavonic months? For those of you that don't understand it, I mean, there are some people that are quite interested in languages generally, and they listen to what my drivel, as I like to call it, and that was really for them. But there's also people who listen to my films because it sends them off to sleep nicely, and I think what I've just said in this film will probably help those of you as well. But this particular meandering has gone on for so long, it's now looking like half an hour. So therefore, whether I actually manage to upload this in HD, I probably will have to upload this in a lower format, because I don't think I'll get it on. It'll just take too long to render this one as HD. I'll probably pick a smaller, a more economical format to upload it this time, because I've just gone on, as I see now on the top of this camera, I've gone on for about half an hour nearly. So thanks for listening if you have, and I hope you've enjoyed the scenery here where now, I believe that's now crossed the border from Lower Silesia into the Opole district, although when it exactly happened is not quite clear to me, but I believe we're now in Opole region, which is not strictly speaking Lower Silesia, it's Middle Silesia. So I hope you enjoyed that scenery, and tune in again and learn more weird and wonderful things about Slavonic languages. Thank you.